That will never work. You can't push that. Seriously? Don't. Oh my God, that's other things you can do. That's bad. You probably should find other hobbies. You ever learn how to talk? Stop. Be happy. Quit while you're Don't bother me. I've seen better things. Do you really want to do And my third grade, give it up. Welcome to Horrible Writing, the rawest, most candid, in-your-face writing show on the interwebs because none of us have time to suck. Let's do this. Welcome to Horrible Writing. I'm your host, Paul Sading. With me this time, I have a wonderful author who I am really looking forward to talking to about this topic because this is a very, very, very important topic, not only to me, but socially and on a humanistic level. Who I have with me is Gwen Katz. Gwen is a young adult author, but also has some work coming out. Maybe we'll get to it in the interview about nonfiction, in a nonfiction anthology where we talk about some science and how it can kind of help us writers who want to get science involved in our stories actually do it a little bit better. So Gwen, welcome to Horrible Writing.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I am really interested in talking to you about the topic. And obviously anybody who's listening to the show now has already seen the title of the episode. And it came about under our introduction to each other came about as under controversial circumstances in situation, and you were very kind about raising the platform, raising the voice, and getting attention on the issue. And I asked if you would be willing to do the show, and you were more than willing to do it. So I'm very honored to have you here and to talk about the nature, if you will, for lack of a better term, the nature of being an LGBTQ plus author and the industry itself when it comes to dealing with LGBTQ writers, their fiction, their stories, and, you know, the ugliness of homophobia. So before we get into the controversy that kind of brought us together, I'd love to hear a little bit about your story. Who is Gwen Katz?
I'm an author and I live in Pasadena, and I am mainly known for wearing pilotkas and having a constant revolving door of homeless animals in my house.
Is there a particular kind of animal?
A lot of cats, but we also have chickens right now.
Oh, really? That's an interesting dynamic there, I imagine.
They don't interact with each other.
Probably for the best.
Yes.
For the best. So
the cats would love to meet the chickens.
Oh, I'm sure they would.
The feeling is not mutual.
I am sure they would. So a few months ago now, it's taken us a while because of my interview schedule. I had to kind of put this off for a while, and I appreciated your patience on this. And it might provide a little bit more clarity to now that we're a little removed from the inciting incident, if you will. But a few months ago, I came across you because somehow you came across a call to action that was out there in the writing community at the time. There was a institution, I'll say it like that, who put out a call for submissions, and they had, like all submission calls have, they have criteria of what they'll accept and what they won't accept. This one was a organization that didn't want more adult themes and tending towards violence in not grotesque, but gratuitous vulgarity and sex and things like that. But then they had a rider on that criteria. And the rider, it wasn't even a rider. It was included in things like gore and violence. And included in that was about LGBTQ fiction. I was enraged, and I'm a straight white male. How did you react when you saw that?
You know, honestly, in the year of our Lord 2018, which is when this happened, mostly my first thought was, wow, they're going to regret this. Because luckily, actually, the LGBTQ community is really quite welcomed in the writer community, at least in my part of the writer community. And so I was very happy to see that everyone, including people who aren't part of the community, was very, very outraged by that and just did not consider that acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually very hopeful to see, because even, a decade or 15 years ago, that would have been a very common thing to see, if not explicitly, certainly tacitly.
Mm-hmm. The response was absolutely amazing. I don't think I've ever had that kind of reaction on Twitter on my timeline with notifications. It was very empowering. It was kind of discouraging that anybody, allies or people personally affected or directly affected by that, had to actually rally to that cause. So, like you said, I found the reaction wonderful. I found the need for a reaction to be disappointing, unfortunately. It
was, yes.
Is it in this day and age, we still have to talk about these things. What is important for people, for readers to know about not just the person, the LGBTQ writer, author, but about their fiction and about who they may be servicing with that fiction? What do we on the outside looking in kind of need to know, maybe on a cognitive level or even on an emotional level, about why it's so important to raise voices or come together when stuff like this happens?
Well, I think the important thing to remember is just that if you're a straight person, you come from a culture that is constantly affirming you, and you're just constantly seeing yourself and your relationships portrayed in a positive way in the world around you, which is fine, but you have to remember that that's just not true for LGBTQ people. And so one of the reasons that it's so important to have inclusive literature is that this could be the only thing someone sees, especially I write for young people. And if I write a book with an LGBTQ character portrayed positively, that may be the first character of that type that this reader has ever seen.
Mm-hmm. With your fiction, I want to talk about that in a second, if you don't mind, about writing for a young audience versus just genre fiction, maybe adult fiction, not necessarily adult as in adult content, but for an adult audience. But before we get to that, kind of give us an idea, if you don't mind, what is the landscape like for LGBTQ writers in this day and age, and kind of help us understand what efforts go into establishing that platform or even that air of legitimacy. And is there the support inherently in the readership world for LGBTQ fiction and writers?
Well, it's complex. I think the community of writers is very good and very supportive, and I've found the community at large to just be very, very nice people, and the readers for the most part too. But the overall ecosystem is much more complex. So it's very, very well known that if you write a story with queer women in it, that's much harder to sell. And of course, publishers don't say like this writing contest did, no LGBTQ stories.
Right.
But often you'll just find that you just won't hear back, or they'll be more critical. The critical thing is very noticeable, is that often you'll find criticisms that maybe are even fair criticisms, but just come up more often or are more adamant when it's an LGBTQ story.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen some romances and rom-coms, and they'll get criticized for things like, the plot was kind of contrived, as if straight romances never had kind of contrived plots, but suddenly
right.
This criticism will come to the fore when you're talking about a story with two girls.
Right.
That kind of thing. So it's rarely as blatant as it is with this writing contest, but it's still there, especially on the publishing side.
And that makes me wonder, and if you don't mind sharing, I'm absolutely curious about the experience and what it feels like with how I don't even know how to categorize them in a less than, I don't want to say antagonistic way. I don't want this I don't want to bias your response, but I am curious when you're talking about the reaction and some of the dynamics to the complexity of the environment, if you will. I've seen it. I don't know how prevalent it is, but for an LGBTQ writer, when you see things from the pushback people, those are the people on Twitter who tell you the only reason you got the success you did is because you write gay characters and gay characters are all the rage. I'm sure you have to probably self-editorialize before you take back to a response, but like, I don't get people where that comes from too, but how does a writer respond? If they do, how do they respond to that type of comment back at them? That kind of strips away, I feel it strips away the legitimacy of what you do. And now you're not even talking about your work. You're talking about, this issue or that person's issue with gay characters. But we're not able to celebrate your work in that kind of response. So I'm very curious for you as the creator, how do you handle stuff like that?
Well, in the first place, of course, for centuries in literature, you couldn't publish these stories at all, or you could only publish them if you had a tragic ending, had something bad happen where the characters get their comeuppance at the end. Mm-hmm. So even if we did have a cultural advantage right now, you'd think that would only be fair, honestly. But we really, really don't.
Right.
Of course, if you look at just books that come out today, new releases, the vast, vast majority of them have straight romances in them. Mm-hmm. And you'll get maybe a few dozen queer books out of hundreds of new releases in my age category every year.
So I guess that will lead me right into the question I wanted to ask earlier about the young market. Is there something unique to that, to writing YA fiction with LGBTQ characters? Does it present unique challenges to you? And if there are writers listening to you right now who also want to write, whether we're talking about just general fiction or YA fiction with gay characters, what would be some of the unique challenges and maybe benefits to the market? And then what would they need to kind of think about, maybe prepare themselves for?
I think YA is actually one of the most inclusive segments of the market, and LGBTQ literature is just doing very, very well in that sector compared to adult or other types of literature. And just, I think young people today have grown up, for the most part, in a very inclusive environment. They've grown up and they have people they know who are gay, who are married. They might have an uncle or an aunt or something, and they have classmates who are out openly and things like that. And of course, many of them are also LGBTQ themselves. And so I think that's just very natural to them to see that represented in stories. Whereas even people my age, when I was in high school, gay was a slur, it was an insult.
Right.
And things have changed very rapidly. So I think that's really nice to see that young people, especially the young readers, are really embracing of LGBTQ identities.
No, that is great. That is even more of encouraging of an answer than I anticipated. So that is great to hear. And my follow-up question kind of really doesn't follow up so well now, but I think it's important, especially because many of the listeners of this show are folks who are working very hard on their craft and may not even be published yet. And if they are, it's one or two works that they've got out there. So as a community, we're still very much newer writers. So I think it's important for them to hear this. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask about your personal experience, but about any problems that you have faced as a result of the fiction that you've published, and if there was any unique reader reaction that kind of like caught you by surprise, or was something you had to hit the pause button and think about in how you were going to react to it?
I actually have not had any reactions to my work or me specifically that have been very strongly negative based on LGBT content. My first novel that came out does have a straight romance, is the central romance. It has LGBT characters in it, but they're not the main characters. So that's part of it. But I've done other works that were, and I was very worried at first. I remember I have this queer anthology I participated in that I was selling at my first event. And I remember my first event, it was there on the table, but I was just not quite sure. It was a children's book fair, and I was there with my YA books, and I was not quite sure, like, should I be plugging this? Are parents going to get mad at me? And when I started talking to people about it, I was just amazed that it was just no big deal. I wasn't getting anyone saying like, oh, what about the kids or anything like that. And after that, I've just been really completely confident.
You know, and I think I'm glad you actually said that, because that's... Listeners, I'm not talking to Gwen right now. I'm talking to you, especially if you identify like me. You're straight, because I want you to hear what she just said. She had to think about that. When we are sitting at a table with our books, do we stop and think about, can I market this? Can I talk this kid up with the book that I have to offer? I can do that with one of my books because it's very adult themed and the horror is pretty grotesque. I know easily it's black and white for me. It's not for people under 18. I didn't write it for them. But for anything else I have, I don't even think about that. And I think that's something that we straight people don't necessarily stop and think about sometimes, is the fact that Gwen even has to do that. You know what I mean? I think that's you gave me a profound moment there, Gwen, and I really appreciate that, because I think it's something that we need to, everybody has a different type of reaction to when somebody calls them privileged. And that's one of the ways that we can recognize how good we have it as straight people in America in 2019 now already, that we don't even things like that, we don't have to stop and think about. And I'm glad you had that kind of good reaction from it. This is so encouraging of a conversation.
Well, partly it's because I write YA. I write for teenagers. If you write for a younger audience, things get much more difficult. When you write middle grade, there still is that think about the kid's reaction, and you still will get schools sometimes, parents sometimes saying that you shouldn't have this book and it's too mature. You know, you shouldn't be exposing kids who are 8 or 9 or 10 to these kinds of themes and ideas, and picture books even more so.
See, now that's discouraging, because if the picture book had mommy and daddy in the garage or in the backyard, it would be fine. But if it has mommy and mommy in the backyard in the same scene, that's something we shouldn't expose kids to.
Right. And that's just kind of this idea that LGBTQ immediately means like sex, right? And it's mature. So, of course, if you have mom and dad in a picture book, nobody thinks like, oh, this is too mature for kids because mom and dad are probably having sex, not on page, but, in their life somewhere.
Right.
But if you have mom and mom or dad and dad, then people will think that. They'll think like, oh no, these kids will be thinking about sex because these two adults are probably doing it somewhere.
I imagine for gay couples, it's just like straight couples. Everybody has sex. Shocker. And then the longer you go on, you have your ebb and flow of life that changes with it. It's just so weird that we still have to have these conversations. But again, this is why I was so excited that you were open to coming on the show and talking about these things. As writers, this is important for us to hear. Love lost and love found. A boy and his dog. A motorcycle trip with a ghost. A girl and her dream. Strange things happening on the farm. Holiday tales and stories of yesteryear. Small town, big city, and everywhere in between. The joys of a tender friendship, a moment in the sun, to the last sensations of a lingering kiss. Our lives are filled with stories, and it is those stories that we leave as our legacy. Coming spring 2019, from the Horrible Writing Writer Support Facebook group, is the Stories We Tell podcast, a pulsating production about our stories, the stories of us. Subscribe today on your favorite podcatcher. Find us on Twitter at TSWTpod. And join our Facebook community by searching for the official Stories We Tell podcast group. For more information, head over to paulsading.com/the stories we tell. Just so everybody knows, this may be your first episode of the show, and you came along because you wanted to hear Gwen talk. That's great. Welcome. Glad to have you here. But the tagline of this show from episode 1 was empowerment through candor. I fully believe in writers not treating each other like competition and actually helping each other out, lifting each other with our efforts. So, Gwen, I ask you this next question in that spirit of telling us what we kind of need to hear, especially as straight writers. How can we be better allies from a writer perspective? So not just Paul being Paul, but Paul the author. And then kind of a follow-up to that. How can we be better allies as straight writers, but what is one thing that you feel, if anything, one thing you feel as straight writers I shouldn't ever do with gay characters?
Okay, well, as I said earlier, I think, especially amongst writers in the writing community, I don't see bigotry that's overt very often. Mm-hmm. But I think it'll be an undertone in people's thoughts that they may not be realizing they have. So I want you to just think, especially when you're reading, maybe you're beta reading or you're just reading another author's book, and if you start having negative thoughts about their characters, their LGBTQ characters, or the situations they're in or the things they do, I really want you to interrogate that. And that doesn't mean that you can't say negative things about an LGBTQ book in a review or something, but I really want you to think carefully about, would you be making these same criticisms if the characters were straight? Or are you just kind of unconsciously or subconsciously bringing biases to the work that you may not even realize you have? Mm-hmm. And as for things that you should never have a gay character do, I think I'm going to go back to the basics and just say, usually in most circumstances, you don't want to kill off your gay character's love interest. The tragic gays thing, that is still something we see a lot. Not so much in books anymore, still sometimes, but a lot on TV shows and stuff where they'll reveal like, oh, surprise, this character is gay, and here they have a boyfriend, and then very next episode, oh, boyfriend ate it, that kind of thing. And that's something that's still very common and very tiresome.
Okay. No, and that's a great characterization of it, tiresome. That's a powerful word. And that's good stuff. That's good stuff for us to hear. Now, let's kind of flip this, because there may be folks listening who think that advice is great, but they themselves are an LGBTQ plus writer. And that's whether or not that's their market, that's who they are. Now let's talk to them, especially if they are an emerging writer, they're new, maybe even a younger writer who's really wanting to kind of get some advice on the way ahead. What are some pieces of advice that you would give to that broad? I know it's a pretty broad spectrum, and I apologize for that, but that broad spectrum of writers who may be just starting out or maybe have been dabbling, but they themselves identify LGBTQ and they're getting into this. They've heard you say that the writing community is supportive, but what other pieces of advice would you give to them?
Oh, it's tricky because the community is supportive, but it's also challenging. So it's not a secret that, like, I sold my first book that had a straight romance in it, And the second book I wrote, which is also about women during World War II, but it has a lesbian romance in it. And that one I haven't been able to sell yet and has had a much, much harder time. So it can be difficult. The market can be difficult. But I really do want to be encouraging. I want writers to not self-reject. I think a lot of writers will think that they may as well not even try subbing to publishers or agents because it's just not going to work, and that they have no choice but to just self-publish or something, which can be the right route for a lot of people. But I want you to not assume that you wouldn't be able to get this out in the traditional market, because the market is changing. It's changing very rapidly.
Mm-hmm. Have you found or talked to other writers, because maybe you don't have extensive experience yourself in it, but when it comes to, traditional versus indie publishing, have you found that you would maybe refer a new writer one way or another if they were just starting their journey?
It's 100% about you. They're just very different. They're both completely legitimate career choices. They just have different pros and cons. So self-publishing has a lot of virtues. You have complete artistic control over your work, and that can be very important for LGBTQ writers. It is possible for agents and editors to want you to do things with your characters or with your work to make it sort of more palatable to a mainstream audience, so as they see it, that you're not going to be okay with. And so self-publishing allows you to really write the story that's true for you and not worry about other influences who want you to turn it into something else. But on the other hand, traditional publishing really lets you get it out there to a very broad audience. And a lot of audiences will consider it, will find those books and read them that might not have found them if you self-published them. So it's 100% just what you think is the right option for you.
That's great advice. That's excellent advice. One of the things that I'd love your response on, Gwen, is I try to be very careful about the message that I send on the show, because I don't know everybody who's on the other end of the earbuds for each episode, but I'm very much into empowerment, recognizing that I'm a straight white male in America. So I try to keep that in the forefront of my mind when I try to do empowerment, because I'm a huge cheerleader for everybody, but I also realize that I can defeat people sometimes with my rah-rah, go get 'em coming from me. One of the things I say on this show quite often is trying to encourage people to take your space. There's space for you out there. It is yours. You have to go take it. Coming from your perspective, though, if you were a new writer or even just you yourself right now today, and you hear that message coming from someone like me, what is that possible type of reaction that you might have, and how could it be better framed for people in the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, well, there can be different considerations going on there, because a lot of LGBTQ writers, especially if they're writing something that's a little bit outside what the mainstream likes to see, they do just hit up against that wall. Mm-hmm. And it can happen that you can be as empowered as is humanly possible, and you can still sometimes not make it in the book world. Mm-hmm. But of course, I don't want to turn people off from that. It can be a difficult market, but I really want people to still go for it, because
right.
I think that's the only way we actually get progress is if people are attempting to change the market and improve things.
Right.
But the particular thing is, I do see a lot of LGBTQ authors switching to a more acceptable market segment. And a lot of them write straight romances because they find that that's easier to sell, or sometimes writers who are lesbian, who are queer girls, prefer to write characters who are queer boys because those are much, much easier to sell. And if that's just your passion, and if that's what you enjoy writing, you should certainly do that. But I see a lot of people who I think the story of their hearts is stories about people like them, but they feel the need to write stories about people who are not like them because they think that'll sell better. And I really want to encourage those people to really try to write the story that's telling your story, if that's what's in your heart.
Mm-hmm. No, that's beautiful. That's excellent. And anything I can do to help that writer who just heard Gwen say that, please reach out to me so I can help give you a platform for that. Now, Gwen, at this point, I'm going to be a good host, like I always am, to my guests, and I'm going to ask for your horrible writing experience. Now, listeners, if this is your first episode, you may have no idea why I'm asking Gwen to talk up something like a horrible writing experience, but give me a chance. I believe wholeheartedly, if people like Gwen come onto the show and they share their horrible writing experience, whatever it may be, I have no idea what she's about to say. But if they can share an experience that they've gone through and they've come out the other side of accomplishing what Gwen has accomplished, it's a clear message that shows us that we can do that too. So in that spirit, Gwen, what is your horrible writing experience?
I think my best one I have to share is that I sent my first story for publication when I was 12.
Wow, that is awesome.
And I had written this picture book, and I was just absolutely sure, like, this is going to get published. And I was sending it out to publishers, and this was back when you had to actually print it out and put it in an envelope and mail it to the publisher. And I got back a lot of rejections, of course. And nowadays I kind of cringe thinking, oh, those poor editorial assistants who got this story written by a 12-year-old. And I'm sure they were just looking at that going like, this was definitely written by a small child. And I will say they were all very polite in rejecting me.
That is awesome.
And I hope none of them are still working today, and I hope none of them are seeing me now being like, is that the person who wrote that picture book when she was like 12,
Who knows? They might think it's neat that you hung around and you didn't go, I don't know, take up some other career path like accounting or something. I don't know.
Maybe. Hopefully, if they did happen to remember me, they would appreciate that I've grown as a writer in the past 20 years.
And that's the thing. And it's funny you say that, because I was going to take away my lesson learned from your experience as, measuring that growth. I think yours is a pretty extreme example looking back at yourself as a 12-year-old, obviously. But I think as writers, it's important for us to never, ever, ever lose sight of the fact that we're going to hopefully always grow if we keep working on our craft, and to not get stuck in that death cycle of editing that first manuscript for years and years. I mean, I know, and I'm sure you do too, Gwen, know writers who have a wonderful book that they've been editing for years and upon years, and they're just not going to ever release it to the world. I like it as a measuring stick. You look back at the earlier stuff and you go, but people still enjoy it. You're out there and you're moving forward and growing as a writer. So I think that's a great lesson to take away from that. And I love that you just did it. When I asked you the question about take your space, and what you just shared is an example. I mean, that's manifesting the take your space mentality. You were 12 and you were like, screw it. You're going to get this published in your magazine or as a children's book because I'm that awesome. And you didn't stop. That is so, so awesome. So
yeah, well, the positive side of that experience was I was being treated by these publishers like an adult. They were reading my story and they were rejecting it, but they were rejecting it on even footing with other stuff. They weren't treating me like a kid,
right.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice, little Susie, your little story you wrote. And I had an adult friend who was a writer who I showed my book to. And I remember her being the one who looked at this manuscript and actually went, oh, no, this isn't publishable. And the reason why is there's this problem here. It shifts point of view. It head hops. And so that's why this story, you're not going to be able to publish it. And that actually being a very positive experience for me is having someone look at my work like an adult and evaluate it as in terms of whether it's actually publishable quality. And they said it wasn't, because of course it wasn't, but that helped me grow as a writer, and that helped me feel like I was being treated like a real writer and not just like a kid who has a silly hobby.
Exactly. No, thank you for that, and thank you for saying that portion of it. And now that everyone's had a chance to really, really benefit from your experience and your perspective on things, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing that stuff. But I do want to give you a chance to talk about some of the stuff that you've got out there so that now listeners who've heard you kind of fall in love with you, they want to go check out what you've actually done. Where would you point them at? Do you want to talk about some of your work that you've got out there and maybe give us a little hint of what's to come?
Mm-hmm. Well, my novel is Among the Red Stars, and it's the story of Russia's famous all-female bomber regiment, the Night Witches. And that came out in 2017. And another book I thought your listeners might be interested in is I'm in this new anthology, putting the science in fiction, put together by Dan Cobalt. And that's one where experts in different fields come together and share tips for writers on how to make their book more realistic in terms of science and how things work, especially in science fiction and fantasy.
Awesome. I'll make sure I put that out there for folks. Now, you are still looking to put some other stuff out there, right? You're trying to get a second book on the market. Are you doing anything in the independent space?
Not right now.
Okay.
So it may not be, I may not have anything coming out in the very near future.
Okay. If you ever do, you make sure I know so I can put that in there. But listeners, as far as Among the Red Stars and putting the science and fiction, I'm going to also link those in the show notes. So you don't have to go anywhere to go find them. Just scroll down on your player and you'll have those things hyperlinked so you can go directly to them. Gwen, I do want to thank you for your time and coming on and talking about this. Again, I want to reframe it to the positive progressive. It was an ugly incident that brought us together, but it also just resulted in, thousands of people being able to hear a message about how we can reframe it and how we can support each other and our LGBTQ friends in the space. So I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Where can folks find you on the internet? Where would you like them to find you?
I think I'm most active on Twitter, and my handle is @GwenCKatz. So you can always find me there, or you can always look me up on my website, GwenCKatz.com.
All right. I will put those in the show notes as well. Again, Gwen, I thank you for your time. And listeners, keep being epic. This has been Horrible Writing, and hopefully after this episode, you suck less than you did at the beginning. I am Paul Sading, your host extraordinaire. You can find me over on the Twitterverse @WritingHorrible and over at paulsading.com/horrible-writing. Until next time, suck less.